In this second screencast on photosynthesis, we're going to continue talking about the reactants and the products of this metabolic process. So recall that, in effect, the photosynthesis is cell respiration just run in reverse. It's powered by light. So in cellular respiration, what happens is we oxidize glucose all the way down to carbon dioxide, and we produce water. The fall of the electrons downhill to the final electron acceptor called oxygen in electron transport is going to produce a whole bunch of ATP molecules of chemical energy through the process of chemiosmosis. Photosynthesis, on the other hand, is not an oxidation, but rather it's a reduction of carbon dioxide to these carbohydrates, to glucose, and will produce oxygen, which actually comes from the splitting of the water. And so this is going to use the light energy to split this water and actually boost electrons uphill rather than having them fall downhill. And it's an endergonic process. So we said before, photosynthesis involves two pathways. They're called the light reactions and then the carbon fixation that happens in the Calvin cycle. So the light reactions, and by their name they need to have the light to do this, that's where the cells convert light energy into chemical energy. Of course, that is ATP, and then the plant side, or the photosynthesis side electron carrier called NADPH, which is slightly different than the one that we've talked about a lot with cellular respiration. The carbon fixation reactions are going to use that ATP and the electron carriers along with the carbon dioxide to produce the carbohydrates, to produce the sugars. So we're going to talk about these two processes within photosynthesis, the light reactions that of course involve or are dependent on the presence of light, and then the Calvin cycle, or the carbon fixation that can happen independently of the light. The light reactions of photosynthesis involve an electron transport chain, much like in cellular respiration. Again, it's proteins that are embedded in the organelle membrane. In the chloroplast, in plants, it actually happens on the membrane inside the chloroplast called the thylakoid membrane. And remember, in cellular respiration, it happened in the internal mitochondrial membrane. So it involves electron acceptors. The electron acceptors in photosynthesis are NADPH. This again is going to produce a proton gradient across the membrane, and we're going to use our old pal ATP synthase. We're going to use that enzyme to harvest some energy from the falling of those protons down their concentration gradient, much like we talked about in electron transport before. It's not accidental that these two systems are similar because they both derived from the same primitive ancestor. So recall in electron transport of respiration, in the mitochondria, there was a transfer of the chemical energy from food molecules, from glucose, to the chemical energy of ATP. And we would use that electron carrier as an input to the electron transport, or NADH. So NADH here would again be oxidized back to its original form, but we would, since that was an exergonic process, we'd harvest that energy to pump these hydrogens across that membrane. And of course we'd build up a concentration over here, and as that concentration gradient was formed, there'd be potential energy. And remember, by chemiosmosis, the falling of those protons through ATP synthase, the help of ATP synthase, we'd be able to oxidatively phosphorylate ATP. This would generate water, as oxygen would be that final electron acceptor as electrons were passed from high energy molecule to high energy molecule. Right? So what would happen if this actually ran in reverse? In the chloroplasts are going to transform this light energy that is absorbed into the chemical energy of ATP. And again, use an electron carrier, a little bit different in plants, NADPH. But in two places, light is going to be absorbed, and we'll talk about photosystem 1 and 2 a little bit later. But remember that photosynthesis is endergonic. So the electron transport chain is driven by light energy. And we'll look at a little more detail later. So if you look at both of these processes, photosynthesis energized by sunlight energy, and respiration energized by the breakdown of carbohydrate, you're going to use that energy for all of these processes. Remember the nursery rhyme, this is the house that Jack built, this is the malt that lay in the house that Jack built, this is the rat that ate the malt that lay in the house that Jack built, this is the cat that killed the rat. I've got kids, I can say that whole thing by heart. But this is the energy that moves the electrons, runs the pump that pumps the protons, that builds the gradient, that drives the flow of the protons through the ATP synthase, that bonds the inorganic phosphate to ADP, that generates the ATP. Boom. So we want to take a look at the pigments involved here, and the number one pigment is chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is the predominant photosynthetic pigment, but there's other accessory pigments involved. They're embedded in the thylakoid membrane. Here's the chemical structure of chlorophyll. Chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B are very similar in structure, and we don't need to know the difference. But they're arranged in what's called a photosystem that will absorb sunlight. And the structure, of course, is once again going to be related to the function here. A quick look at the visible spectrum of color, and we'll notice that if you remember Roy G. Biv from some other grade of some other science class in your younger years, but the visible light, or the light spectrum, is governed or set up by its wavelength. And the visible spectrum is from about 380 nanometers to 750 nanometers. But something to remember is the shorter the wavelength, the higher the energy. And longer the wavelength, the lower the energy. And plant cells tend to be able to absorb energy lower and higher on the visible spectrum. And they often will kick out the green, or reflect the green wavelength of light. So speaking of light, light is, when we talk about it in a wave, we talk about electromagnetic radiation or electromagnetic spectrum. But it can also behave as particles. Those particles are called photons. And it's the photons that can be absorbed by a molecule. And when you add the energy to a molecule, it moves it to a higher state. It moves it to an excited state. So we want to take a look at the absorption spectrum versus the action spectrum. The absorption spectrum is taking light energy that is absorbed versus its wavelength. And the action spectrum is a plot of the biological activity of an organism against the wavelengths that it's exposed to. So here, looking at those two spectrums together, you'll notice that the action spectrum and the absorption spectrum, they have the same trends. There's a link. And so photosynthesis gets the energy by actually absorbing wavelengths of light. And chlorophyll A and B, but chlorophyll absorbs best in red and blue. Those are, again, kind of the extremes of the visible spectrum, and the very least in green. In fact, reflects that color. There's a lot of different accessory pigments, however, with different structures that absorb light in different wavelengths. There's still chlorophyll B, which is slightly different than A, but it's just shifted a little bit. Still going to reflect green. There's the carotenoids and xanthophylls, and there's other types that will give different colors of plant leaves, etc., that absorbed different parts of the spectrum, and therefore they're going to reflect different parts of the spectrum. So next we're going to talk about the kind of the nitty-gritty of photosynthesis, but we got to start to talk about products and reactants, and to talk a little bit about the electron transport that's involved in photosynthesis, and we'll talk a little bit more about light absorption in the next screencast.